jammies. My glasses. Oh.
Looks like we're talking about the city of Thieves. Hello, my fellow enthusiasts. Welcome back to another video. Jesus Christ, it's been a long time since I did an Adventure Time video, but here we are. Now, the city of Thieves is a landmark within the land of Ood. It's a gigantic city that is structured within the shell of a dead tortoise. And the thing is, this structure is actually massive. To give you some perspective, inside of the city, there are numerous buildings, gigantic castles, and full-on shops, and yet there is still plenty of room in terms of the size of the shell. However, in terms of the actual city, it's an absolute pigsty with continuous buildings that are crooked, shoddily built, cracks in the windows, and continuous damage overall. And a good chunk of why that's the case is simply due to the fact that the denizens of this city are, as the name implies, thieves, ruffians, and absolute criminals. This city is barely functional. Even though there are shops in which you can pay for goods, people usually just steal what they need whenever they need it. Or rather, when they just want it. And this extends to pretty much anyone within the city. Even children steal things from full-grown adults. And occasionally, the adults will just flat out steal the children. Statistically speaking, in terms of crime rates, it would probably be one of the worst locations you could theoretically live. However, it should be noted that it's not entirely just the citizens' fault that the city is like this, as there seems to be some kind of magic that permeates the area. Judging by Jake's reaction, it seems as though there's a continuous flow of magic that is actively amplifying one's desire to steal. Don't get me wrong, Jake isn't exactly the paragon of moral virtue, but at the same time, it should be noted at the very least he won't steal if Finn is actively trying to stop him from doing so. That combined with his almost addiction level of compulsion to go for the boots and even stealing them without even realizing it makes me think that there is at least some kind of magic here. With the reason why it doesn't work on Finn being the fact that he literally just has no desire to steal in the first place, so there's nothing to amplify. However, it should be noted that this technically isn't outright stated, so take this with a grain of salt. Another thing that is actually rather interesting is that it seems almost every single thief here in the city, once they actually either desire to steal and attempt to steal something, they immediately become filthy, with visible dirt outlining their skin. Now, interestingly enough, some other thieves have not shown this, however, they all have darker color palettes, so it's possible that they are so dirty that it basically just looks like their skin. So if you see someone in the city who's dirty, there's a decent chance that they're a thief, and if they're not a thief, it just means they haven't bathed in a long time, in which case, why do you even want to be near them in the first place? However, it should be noted that the amount of dirt on someone's body isn't always a dead giveaway, simply due to the fact that we do know bathing is somewhat common within the city, and since we know this dirt can be washed off, it's quite possible that seasoned members of the city simply bathe in order to avoid people believing that they are also a thief. Now, lastly, we have the King of Thieves, and here's the thing, there's really not much to go on because unfortunately he's dead by the time we actually see him. To make matters even worse, we're not even really sure about his backstory or his original origins. However, let's go ahead and do something that we haven't done in a long time and speculate. For one, he's been dead for a pretty decent chunk of time, considering that no one's really seen him in ages. He's been there long enough to the point where his bones have begun to decay and he has lost all flesh from his original form. However, I do not believe that he's been dead for that long. Here's the thing, considering that it was technically left out in the open and rats have been eating him for an extended period of time, he could not have been dead for more than a year. In fact, it was most likely even sooner, considering that there was a rat inside of his skull still somehow managing to survive within his castle. So taking this into consideration, it means that he had to have died somewhat recently. However, this opens up a lot of questions, mainly due to the fact that the way he died is an absolute mystery, but here's the thing, there are a couple things that hint that he may have been murdered. The first and most obvious is the fact that his treasure chest is literally shoved within his chest cavity, and going by the idea that he's not insane enough to cut open his own chest and shove his own loot inside of himself, I'm going to assume that someone had to do that, and that single act most likely resulted in his death. But here's the thing, this opens up an entirely different can of worms of who exactly would be able to kill him in the first place. Remember that the main people who would want to kill the King of Thieves are other thieves simply due to the fact that he has a buttload of treasure, but his entire castle is coated with magic that keeps thieves out, meaning the only people who would even be able to get to him in the first place are people who are of pure hearts who never stole a day in their lives, or at the very least, someone who never stole within the city, which, considering the sheer amount of magical compulsion that this city provides, is a major feat. However, at that point, none of this really entirely adds up until you start to think of it from the opposite direction. Someone of pure heart who never stole a day in their life most likely isn't sadistic enough to flat out shove a chest of loot into another person's abdomen. Whoever murdered the king most likely had a personal grudge against him, which most likely was another another thief, or at the very least, another criminal, and it's quite possible that he simply stole from the wrong person and it resulted in his death. However, that doesn't exactly match up simply due to the fact that it doesn't answer the idea of why didn't they steal his treasure after his death. The force field doesn't stop people from leaving, it only stops thieves from coming inside in the first place. Since his death doesn't entirely make sense, because even if it was from a hero or a thief, at the very least some of his treasure would be missing, meaning he had to have either been killed by a non-thief or he had to be killed from some other factor entirely. Now, depending on how you look at the animations, there is also a third option, which honestly may not be entirely true simply due to the fact that, again, we are speculating here, but also this may be an animation error. When we originally see the King of Thieves, his chest is not actually within his, well, chest. Instead, it's actually where his stomach would be. Assuming you follow that continuation, it's quite possible that he died from another factor such as starvation or poisoning, assuming the chalice has something to do with the situation. This actually has more sense, at least in the starvation route, when you think about how the force field around his castle actually works. Remember, it does not stop people from leaving, but it stops people from coming back inside. If he were to ever leave his castle, it would result in him losing all of the treasure that he had accumulated up to that point. Taking that into consideration, it's quite possible that he either created the barrier and didn't really think about what was happening, or the barrier was made by someone else entirely. Considering that this is the King of Thieves we're talking about, the man who was most likely one of the most careful individuals alive, or rather was alive, it's quite unlikely that he would not think of something like this. So that leads me to believe one of two things. Either someone else created the barrier entirely, or he created the barrier just right before his death. Now, there are a couple of holes within all of these theories. When it comes to him being murdered, the first thing that doesn't add up is the fact that he's just sitting in his throne with no sign of a struggle. Everything around them is, relatively speaking, in pristine condition. There's nothing broken and everything around him is fine, so I can't imagine any kind of struggle as in a fight. This combined with the second problem, which is the fact that none of his treasure is stolen, makes it very unlikely that he was actually murdered. However, if he wasn't murdered, that makes this even harder to wrap your head around because his chest was stuffed within his chest cavity. It is very unlikely that the king just decided to kill himself by shoving an entire chest within his chest. However, looking at everything that we've covered, it's very likely that that's the only one that makes even remotely any sense so far, which I hate because it actually doesn't. This entire situation makes me incredibly mad simply due to the fact that it just doesn't make sense. The King of Thieves, the most notorious of all thieves, the founder of the city of Thieves, the flat-out creator of the magics that keep the city together, and his death is an entire mystery. A mystery filled with what-ifs, errors, and flat-out things that defy logic. But maybe there's just holes in my own logic. What do you guys think? What do you think resulted in the king's death? What do you think is going to happen to the city now that everyone is basically still thieving from one another? Do you think it will eventually fall apart? Let me know down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon. Thanks again to my patrons. As always, stay enthusiastic. I will see you in the next video. Bye.